Welcome to Entrepreneurs, Executives, and Eccentrics, a podcast dedicated to the stories, strategies, and secrets of remarkable individuals. Join us as we engage in enlightening conversations with intriguing entrepreneurs, accomplished executives, and fascinating eccentrics, exploring their journeys, triumphs, and the unconventional wisdom that has shaped their success. In this episode, we talk with Marilyn Yang, co-founder and CEO of Fun Gal Snacks, the company behind Popadelics crunchy mushroom chips. We explore how she and her husband turned a simple idea during the pandemic into a brand now found in thousands of stores, including Whole Foods. Marilyn shares what it took to scale from concept to retail, the realities of working with distributors, and how she sees the future of food entrepreneurship.
Marilyn Yang, welcome. Please tell me who you are and what your business is.
Yeah, thanks again for having me, Scott. So I am co-founder and CEO of Fun Gal Snacks, which is the parent company of Popadelics crunchy mushroom chips.
So it's mushroom potato chips, for lack of a better word. Not potato, but they're mushroom chips, right? How did you come up with this concept?
Yeah, so I feel like the best ideas, or at least ideas that me and my husband were searching for at the time, are the ones that you think are super simple and should exist already, but for whatever reason just don't. And so it was really serendipitous. Me and my husband both come from finance backgrounds. We've always wanted to do something entrepreneurial. We just really, before, I guess, never really settled an idea that we really were excited about, wanted to pursue. I think most of the time we were actually shut down because we came up with that idea, then we went online and found it already. So it's someone had already done it. And at that point we were like, okay, we don't have the time or energy to compete at that point. Especially if there's a strong kind of first mover out there. And it was during COVID. We were in New York City at the time. We're both big foodies, big mushroom lovers, although we didn't think it would ever come to this necessarily. But, grew up eating a ton of mushrooms. We started seeing a lot of the mushroom coffees and teas come out kind of in that 2019, 2020 time period. So it was kind of in the back of our heads a little bit. And to us, it was kind of like, okay, well, it's about time people caught up. And we've always liked mushrooms. It's kind of funny that people are finally into them now. And so then during COVID, when we were stuck in our New York City apartment, it was really when I guess we were, our highlight of our days was going to the grocery store. And so we started getting really adventurous, just looking for new snacks, new, I don't know, random entrees that we could try to make ourselves. And we started getting into all these different types of vegetable chips. They were making vegetable chips out of like things I never heard of before. So like beet chips, we started trying some, there's been some chickpea snacks and whatever. And so it just kind of organically came up like, we both love mushrooms. Like at first we thought, oh, well, there has to be someone who's made a mushroom chip by now. And so that's how the idea got started. And, we just, again, like before, we just went online to try to find some. We were just customers at that point wanting to eat some mushroom chips. And I think that was kind of that first step where we found that for kind of maybe for one of the first times, at least, there really wasn't anything else out there. All the products that were out there were unbranded, unflavored. I mean, you can find a lot of dried mushrooms out there, but they're not really snacks. They're just dried mushrooms. And so that was kind of like the first, like maybe there's something here moment. This was COVID, so we were really bored. And so we kind of kept going down that rabbit hole. And I think one of the biggest kind of data points we found was we went on Google Trends data, it was the highest amount of people ever searching for mushrooms at that point versus like the early 2000s when Google first started tracking the data. I think this was the sign from the universe when I was, I subscribed to a bunch of these entrepreneurship blogs and newsletters. And in my inbox, maybe like a few days later after we started kind of thinking about it and looking at it, I got a newsletter that was something like, oh, like the mushroom startup boom. And it wasn't just food products. They were, there's a lot of mushroom products or startups kind of around building products, medicine, obviously the psilocybin world. And so that was kind of like, okay, well, maybe we should start looking into this a bit more. And I think what really put us over the edge ultimately was obviously we were bored during COVID, but we just saw kind of the white space because there wasn't a fun modern brand centered around crunchy mushroom snacks on top of there kind of being more interest than ever before in mushrooms. And clearly there's been other successful kind of veggie snacks in the past that, why shouldn't there be a mushroom chip too? And it's kind of like if there's kale chips, beet chips, carrot chips, like why shouldn't there be mushroom chips? And so I think all of those things combined made us I think the first step we took was we went on Rocket Lawyer or whatever it was to just incorporate that business. And it kind of escalated clearly from there.
Yes, because you come from a private equity world, right?
Yeah, I mean, the businesses I invest in and look at kind of in my day job, I guess, so to speak, are much more established businesses. I guess most of them are industrial in nature, and so very different, I guess, than what we ended up starting. I think almost in some ways the complete opposite, because the companies we're investing in, they already have processes and established products, they're already in market, and so it's a very different experience. And I think a lot of maybe what I was able to pick up kind of in my kind of day-to-day experience, just in terms of like the best practices of how a business should be running or shouldn't be doing, I think were helpful to us. But I think at some level it was almost like, I've seen what businesses can become like, 50 steps from now, and it's almost like starting from the beginning. It's like totally different animal too. So I think it's actually helped. I think both sides of the coin and experience have helped me in that other endeavor as well. So, being involved with a startup, I think, has helped me as a private equity investor and vice versa.
Yeah, so all the because before you started your own business, right? All the things that maybe were the concerns of your clients or prospective clients you didn't really have experience with, and now that you've maybe taken your knocks a little bit with starting this new company, it probably helped you understand a lot. I know transparently you're able to understand kind of the clientele and the people that are out there doing the things they do. That when we last spoke, the thing that struck me the most was the fact that you're doing this with two employees. When I say two employees, I mean you and your husband, right? Everything
Yep.
else is been
Yep.
out. Let's talk about that. So
Well, I feel like
you're in New York. You're like, you know what? We should really do this. Let's go do this sweet chili thing. It sounds really good. And you're kind of experimenting a little bit, and you've kind of figured out kind of the direction you're going. You go to Rocket Lawyer. You start your company. What is your next step? What is the very next thing you do? You're like, how the hell are we going to scale this? Who's going to package it? How does this work exactly? What were your next step?
well, I think the number one thing we needed to do, and actually we're both, having lived in New York City at the time, never really eating at home, we weren't cooking at home or whatever, was just to figure out how to actually develop the product. Like we wouldn't have known where to start with, I don't know. We weren't, I feel like unlike some other food entrepreneurs that we know and have heard of, like we didn't start making stuff in our kitchen. I think we admitted defeat right away. Like we're not the right people to be kind of doing that R&D ourselves. So we just don't have the skill set. We don't come from, we like eating, but we don't know the next thing about cooking, especially about creating like a shelf stable kind of viable commercial product that can be, kind of more commercially level produced at a sufficient margin for us to develop a business around it. So there's a lot of things out there. And I think now, I think more broadly, I feel like now is as good of a time as ever to start businesses, even where you might not know how to do things. There's just so many outsourced resources. You have Google, you have the internet. And so I mean, we were kind of lucky, but I think we could have probably gone there even without kind of my previous kind of connection to this one other food founder who ultimately ended up introducing us to the resource. But essentially, number one is we knew we needed help with R&D. And so there's a ton, actually, if you just go online, you can find a ton of outsourced food R&D labs out there. And, they're actually not, I mean, they're not cheap, obviously, but they're not as expensive as you might think either. I think like some are as low, you can find the freelancers who'll do a project for you for a couple $1,000, all the way to, I'm sure there are all the big players who charge you like $100,000 or whatever, a million or whatever. But there's a good sweet spot of some of these vendors specifically actually appealing or kind of marketing their services to startups. And so, again, we were fortunate, or I was fortunate to have, right before we started the business, I was actually starting to kind of look at angel investing. And so I was reaching out to various business owners and, startup owners. And there was this one powdered smoothie brand that I don't know how I came across them. Maybe it was social media, but I was personally a customer of, and I knew they were a new company, and I wanted to pick the brain of the founder, but also to see if maybe they were raising a round and I could become an angel investor. But she was kind enough to, when we had already had a dialogue by then, and so I told her, hey, I want to start this snack company too. And she gave us kind of the name of this one particular consulting firm that helped her kind of when she was first starting, was actually on her company's board now, or one of the founders of that startup consultancy was actually on her board of directors, and was like, oh, you should check these guys out. They do like food R&D work alongside other kind of food startup kind of advice giving. And so we were connected there, but we didn't just right away go with them. We then went online, and I think we were surprised to find there are a lot of firms like that out there that essentially contract anything, right? So we were able to, at that point, we evaluated a few different firms, but we did end up working to that with that firm that we were introduced to. And they were really kind of our outsourced R&D lab. So we basically had a really clear idea of what we wanted the end product to be, but we just had no idea how to get there. But we told them the vision, right? We wanted a crunchy mushroom chip that was in the shape of a whole mushroom. I think it was really important for us earlier on that the end product is a whole mushroom, just to show people that, there's nothing funny kind of being cut into this. It really is a mushroom. It's not, 2% mushrooms and like the rest of it's corn, right? So we really wanted to show that it was a full mushroom. And also, I think as part of what I think it's evolved over time, but I think what we've really triangulated on is our broader mission with the product and Popadelics as a brand is to make mushrooms mainstream of all kinds. And I feel like mushrooms haven't always had the best reputation in food or cuisine. A lot of people don't like mushrooms or claim they don't like mushrooms. And so I think it's really to show people that, you might think you don't like mushrooms, but it's really more that you haven't had mushrooms in a way that you've liked them. Or maybe it's not the right mushroom, right? I think people don't realize there's so many different types of mushrooms out there too.
Yeah, I love the fact that you're like, you know what, we believe there's this trend, and for those of you listening, Google trend or Google Trends, right, is kind of a keyword lookup search where you can kind of see, is there anything like recently that people have been looking up that may have not been on the board before, and Google Trends will kind of show you those, especially if you give it an idea. Food as an example. What did you type into Google Trends? You probably food trends or something like that in your search.
Well, you can search for specific terms. So we just plugged in mushrooms. Then I think we plugged in things that were in and around mushrooms and mushroom, health benefits, mushrooms. And
Right.
it shows you kind of the comparative index versus a point in time. So at least versus when Google first started tracking the data, which was like 2004 or whatever. At the time when we looked at this would have been in 2020. It was at an all-time high. So 100 in the index is the all-time high. It was at 100, basically, at the point we were searching in 2020.
Yeah, I just love how you're like, okay, well, now we understand this understanding. So let's go piece that together with an R&D that you can also outsource, which is, I had no idea that was a thing. So now you're outsourcing to this other company who didn't know. Were they just giving you, like, how did that work? So they would develop a product or something and they'd send it to you and you'd be like, well, that's terrible or that's good. How did that work exactly? Out of curiosity.
Yeah, pretty much. I mean, we told them exactly what we wanted. So in terms of, the crunchy mushroom, full mushroom, all of that. And we, I think part of what was really good about working with them is they're part of a broader consultancy that does, we ended up using them for other things too, but operational kind of setup as well. They helped set us up with our co-packer, et cetera. But they were really developing the product with ultimately, kind of a viable business in mind, because I feel like a lot of really good food products can be developed, but expensively. And so you can't produce at scale at a price point that makes sense to actually be, for you to get a cut, for the distributor to get a cut, for it to not end up on the shelf at like $50 or something crazy. And so I think what was really great about this particular company was they were developing the product not only with kind of what our goal was for the final product in mind, but also keeping in mind kind of the ingredients they were using, the processes they were using, that they were scalable. So scalable from both a cost and a process perspective. Like, we weren't trying to do something super, super obscure, although we kind of ended up more obscure than maybe we were expecting. But, something that was at least doable longer term. So because you can, there's a lot that can be done in the food world these days. You probably develop something that was like very low calorie, but tasted really good, but, would cost like $100 or whatever on the shelf. And so I think, from the beginning, and I think this comes from both of our maybe more business backgrounds, we knew that at the end of the day, the product, needed to be commercially viable to be able to develop into a longer term business. And so we were really focused on that even from the beginning. But I think even more than that, we were focused on the product just tasting good, because we knew we were kind of developing a new category, a new product type. And if it didn't taste good, and, we understand not everyone's going to like everything, but if it generally didn't taste good, then we're not going to be converting anyone from a mushroom doubter to a mushroom lover. And so, we, that's exactly how it worked. We started after a period of time, obviously they had to do their R&D work, but within, just a few weeks, we were starting to get samples. And I think number one thing was texture. We wanted to be as crunchy as possible to really kind of alleviate a lot of people's
Balance the
yeah,
mushy mushroom, right? The
exactly.
whatever, their idea of what a mushroom is.
Exactly. We just wanted it to be as close to a chip something crunchy as possible. People, for people to even forget that it is a mushroom. So that was definitely a big one. And then I think after that, it was really just getting the flavors right. And, I wish we were more scientific about it, but the 3 flavors that we ended up triangulating on. So we have trip and truffle parm, red rosemary and salt, and twisted Thai chili. And they're all vegan, gluten-free, non-GMO as well. So I think, making sure that all of the flavors could be made so that they checked all those boxes was definitely a big one. By the end of the day, we wanted them to taste a certain way. And again, where I was going with that was, we didn't do a poll figuring out what flavors we should launch with. They were quite literally just 3 of my favorite flavors generally for cuisine.
So I mean, you really you start by maybe you start to sound like a normal business, right? I mean, I realize in from my perspective, and I think probably from your PE perspective, food is not necessarily normal, right? But it still has a product development. There's and then distribution. Some and you're selling something at some price point where there's some wholesale type of market and some retail type of delta, right? That's large enough for the retailer to want to sell it. So, can you talk about distribution for a moment? How far are you into this journey? This was 3.5 years ago ish, right? Did you start the company?
It might be on the dot, maybe within a few days. We went to Rocket Lawyer and incorporated in July of 2020. So it's been exactly 4 years since the journey's formally started, at least. Obviously, we were talking about it, thinking about it for a few months before that. But anyway, kind of a crazy journey for that. So maybe to kind of go back to the timeline, we, launched, I guess, formally incorporated in July of 2020. We were in R&D and we launched the first version of our product in April of 22. And we're now on probably the 7th version of our product, 6th or 7th. So we made a lot of small tweaks along the way. And I would say that although we formally launched in April of 22, our product didn't truly launch until probably like March of 23, because that was probably the version of our product that we really pushed forward. And namely, we started out because we were developing the product during the depths of COVID, thinking we would be much more online oriented than we ended up becoming. I mean, we do have an online presence. Obviously, we have a website. We sell on Amazon. We sell on some other online retailers. But we really just focused almost right away, straight away, in terms of getting into some of the major natural food retailers. So it happened very quickly. I feel like it took a lot of setup, I guess, to get there, because with the bigger chains, the decision-making processes are much more formalized and happen on kind of on a calendar year basis. But, today, for example, so just about, call it a year and a half from our formal launch date, we're now in over 3,000 stores. We launched earlier this year in Sprouts, Fresh Market, CVS, Ralph's, Wakefern. We're launching in Whole Foods later this week. And so all of that happened. It's one of those things where I feel like I read about, like, I feel like you read about all the time, people saying like, oh, like no overnight success happens overnight. Like, I feel like people who haven't been following us, they're like, oh, wow, like how'd you get into these places overnight? And it's like, it's been 4 years coming, right? And it's kind of surreal, because one of the first things we did when we were even doing research on whether we wanted to pursue the idea was we went to our local Whole Foods and Hudson Yards in New York, and we took pictures of that kind of they have this like healthy snacks section where there's like the kale chips and the seaweed and whatever. We took a picture. And so I still have that picture. And I think what's crazy is our product will be in that exact spot come later this week, almost exactly 4 years later. So it's kind of crazy to see, because at some level to us, it feels like it was just yesterday, but it felt like it's been a whole lifetime since then.
Yeah, I know, but compared to kale chips, I'll choose your product, a mushroom product, any day of the week, right? Kale sounds gross. Crunchy mushrooms sounds rad. I think you're going to absolutely crush it. What was that process for Whole Foods? That had to been interesting.
Yeah, well, I would say this goes for all of the bigger retailers. So what we found was how we started getting into retailers was, pretty much dialing for dollars, I guess, for lack of a better term, or maybe more like emailing for dollars. I feel like also, unlike a lot of other food startups we've heard of, we didn't necessarily start local. Part of that is because we had to jump. I don't want to get too deep into it, but we had to jump straight into essentially pretty large volumes of production, because the way that our product ultimately had to be made, it required machinery that you just can't, there's just no home version of it. So you need to do it in like a professional food processing facility. And so right off the bat, we just had a lot of product to sell. And so we didn't have the luxury of being able to make a small batch and go to our farmer's market. We still did those things. Like we still did local markets. We did a lot of vegan, vegetarian markets, but that wasn't going to get us to the volume we needed to sell our product quick enough. And so we really needed to go broader. And so we were emailing, we just went online, found lists of, and I think my husband did most of the legwork on this, so I have to give him the credit for doing all of this. But he went online, found lists of independent natural food retailers nationwide, and just started emailing and calling them. And I think one of the first stores that took us on was actually in the Pacific Northwest, which is quite literally almost on the exact opposite end of the country where we were. And part of it was we were just getting out of COVID, so there weren't as many of those in-person kind of market opportunities yet either. I mean, they were coming back, but it was really on us to try to get into retail doors. And then I think from there, I think one of our other early lucky breaks was, I think maybe this was us coming from the backgrounds we did, but right away we were like, okay, we're going to target retail. We should go to some of the big trade shows in the industry. And so, we launched formally in April 22. By June of 22, we were at our first trade show, which I think for people listening, I feel like in some ways that might be a bit too early. I mean, we were naive and we didn't know any better, but I feel like in some ways it was a bit too early for us to have done a trade show because we knew nothing about selling into retail stores like a Whole Foods or whatever. But we just did it. And so, but I think it was a great proof of concept for us to have done it. It was Summer Fancy Food Show. And we just got so much positive reception, even if it wasn't a buyer, right? If it was like someone selling freight brokerage services, they just liked the product. And I think for us to get that type of, at least validation that people liked eating it, I think was enough for us at that point. But on top of that, we had a few lucky breaks out of that show. Namely, we were able to get into kind of a special holiday selection for Urban Outfitters in all of their stores, kind of coming out of that show. I guess RIP Foxtrot, but that was also where we initially met with Foxtrot, which was one of our first kind of bigger multi-location retailers as well. And I think that gave us the momentum we needed to then go to that next step, which was, I think this was what we initially learned at that show and kind of subsequently on. If you want to sell to these bigger chains like a Whole Foods, you need to work through some of the bigger food distributors in this space. And you can't, they're not going to just work with you direct if you're kind of a brand of our size. And so, we were able to sell to these independent natural food stores directly. But if we really wanted to get to the next level, we really had to start thinking about distribution. And we were really weary about distribution in the beginning because it felt like they were just taking all of our margin and what would we have to benefit from it, right? And, I still have my questions about longer term, whether or not that's sustainable for smaller brands or if that's the best way for smaller brands. But, I think we've been able to get to a good place. I think we've had great relationships with all the distributors that we now work with. And we took advantage of a few pitch competitions as well. So I think really just taking advantage of all the resources out there. So we were able to get into KeHE, which is one of the bigger kind of natural foods distributors, through a pitch competition. And so, we just kept our eyes out for these opportunities to kind of, I guess, if nothing else, just fast track getting our product and our brand in front of the right people. And I think it was more that once we were in these distributors, not only did the distributors and their sales teams help us with kind of pitching to these bigger chains, but then when we were directly having the conversation, it at least takes one reason for them to say no off the table.
Right, because we're already in the distributor. They're already going to get it
Exactly.
to you. You already know how to do business with them. There's already PO orders. All that stuff's already been agreed upon. All you got to do is convince them to go buy it from a distributor, which is a way easier ask.
For sure, because I think very early on, kind of at that first, Summer Fancy Food Show we actually met with Whole Foods then. And I think that might have been one of the first times we'd even heard of the concept of a distributor in this space, right? It was like we were going in really, really fresh at that point. And so it took us a few months to wrap our heads around it to really learn the dynamics. But I think we started kind of seeing and hearing that it was a really easy way for retailers to just say no. Even if they liked your product, it was more just like, I guess, their way of vetting that if you were ready or not. Not that you can't get into these retailers without being in a distributor yet, because they will sometimes, it can happen either way. You either get into the distributor first or you get into the retailer first and they help you get into the distributor after. But I feel like for us, we thought it made the most sense to just remove that no off the table when we were speaking to the retailers and find kind of creative ways to get in with the distributors. And so that pitch competition was, for example, one of the ways we got into KeHE. We also separately got into DPI through a pitch competition. DPI Foods is another specialty foods distributor. Actually, they were acquired by KE shortly thereafter, which is kind of funny because we got into both of them independently through their own pitch competitions. But I guess that's one other thing too. I think coming from kind of the broader business world, like we knew conceptually that there would be programs like this out there. And so we just really just kept our eyes peeled for them. And we really wouldn't be where we are today if we hadn't taken advantage of every little thing that's out there to help benefit, I guess, small businesses, and in particular, in my case, like small minority founded businesses.
It's interesting. So from coming from my other question is coming from the PE world, in the back of your head, have you said, we're gonna try to build this to sell it off eventually, right? There's some exit plan in the future. Were you building that from day one, built a sell scenario, or is it no, we're just gonna make a product and we'll figure out where it takes us?
I think we knew it was a bit different than that. I guess it wasn't necessarily we were building to sell, but we were building the business more for kind of a life experience and kind of something we wanted to do more so than this being the one thing we wanted to do for the rest of our lives. If that made sense. Like we didn't feel like we set out on life wanting to be, forever running a snack business, for the rest of our days necessarily. I think ultimately both me and my husband, we like doing a lot of different things. That's which is why I'm doing this. I have my, private equity investing career. I do some angel investing and other sorts of startups that I'm advising or involved in as well. I think in general, like both of us as like, just from our personality and just what we're interested in broadly, like we never saw ourselves just doing one thing. And so we always knew that even if, it wasn't an exit or whatever, we would be doing this in the context of maybe other things as well that we were also interested in. And so I think it's more that I don't think we would have anticipated, I think, how quickly the product and brand has grown, but also the way it happened was a bit different as well. Because again, we weren't setting off necessarily thinking that we would be so retail focused right away. But I think on top of that, we knew that there would come a point where the business might be too big to sustain us, doing it the way we have, where we're using all these outsourced third parties. And I think we can keep the business running the way it is at the size now, but it's almost, I feel like we're nearing a point where it's almost like the business might deserve more. Or I think we've been able to prove the concept enough that there's more to come from it.
Right.
And so I think it's more of just recognizing from the get-go that, and I think people have, all these business writers have written about all the time, but the person that starts the business is not necessarily the right person to run the business once it's a multi-billion-dollar company or whatever, right? The best startup founder is not necessarily the best, Fortune 500 company CEO. And so I feel like I think we always knew that there would come that transition point where we might just not be the right people to be running the business day to day anymore. And I think our goal was to get the company to that point where, we weren't the right people anymore.
That's I don't know. I love that you came up with an idea, executed it. 4 years later, you're on Whole Foods. It's gotta kind of blow your mind too. I mean a little bit. I mean, if you're getting in Whole Foods this week, exactly 4 years ago when you guys came up with this concept. Is there one or two or three big items that if you go back and tell Marilyn Yang, 4 years ago to do this differently, what would it have been?
Probably just really double down on retail right away. I think we really battled the idea of working with distributors for longer than we probably needed to have. I think at one point, I mean, this maybe comes with our rebellious spirit, but we were like, we want to dismantle the distribution model and just go direct and, keep all the margins and all of that. And, I feel like if you're willing to grow very slowly, I'm sure there's a way to do that. And I'm sure it's not impossible to do that, but just because of the realities of us having to commit to large production runs, needing to get onto the timeline. And I think nothing matches as well just getting the product in front of the customer. So at the end of the day, if the customer shops at Whole Foods, you just need to be at Whole Foods. And for our product, our customer is the one who shops at a Sprouts, a Whole Foods, and we just need to be there because that's where they're looking for us. And we think very early on, it took us we were doing, a number of these more in-person markets right away. And the number one thing that everyone would always say to us is, we love your product, whatever. They don't even care that we're online or on Amazon. They were like, are you guys in Whole Foods? That's like the number one thing we always got asked. And so we just, I think it took probably longer than it should have for that to have sunk in for us that, hey, we just need to get into retail. And then I was just going through the motions, and I think understanding the dynamics of the industry, I think it would have been helpful for us because we just dove straight in, like knowing nothing about the industry. I think it would have been helpful for us to have maybe spoken to other food founders in a bit more detail beforehand. I did speak to that one smoothie brand, but they were a bit different because they were kind of more focused on like selling to hotels and universities, a bit different animal than selling to like a Whole Foods or whatever. And so I think it would have really benefited for us to have, even gone onto one of these like expert networks or like tapped our own networks to speak to a previous food founder so that we could have learned about all of this maybe earlier. I mean, at the same time, though, I do feel like us being naive maybe helped us in a
Right.
way because we didn't go in with those preconceived notions. But at the same time, it's like, I think we could have, kind of skipped some of that heartache if we just knew off the bat. But I also think, and me and my husband talk about this all the time, that if we had spoken to someone before we started this and knew every nitty
You wouldn't
gritty
do it.
about how hard it is to work with distributors, how hard it is in retail, yeah, to your point, we probably wouldn't have done it. So I don't know. It's always like, everything's retrospect's always it's a
Right.
weird thing to think about.
Marilyn Yang, thank you so much for coming on. This is fascinating, and I guess we'll talk very soon in the future.
Awesome. Yeah. Thanks again for having me, Scott.
Thank you.